Hello, my name is Kerry Glann, and I teach at Ball State University in Indiana, and I serve Midwestern ACDA as the repertoire-specific R&R coordinator. And it's my pleasure to bring you one of the first in a series of professional development videos and seminars that Midwest ACDA is producing this spring, all the brainchild of our region president, Derek Fox. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Richard Sparks, who has had a distinguished conducting career in the choral world for many decades and in many different venues. Dr. Sparks was Director of Choral Activities at Pacific Lutheran University from 1983 to 2001, where he conducted the Choir of the West. And then he taught at the University of North Texas, where he led the University Singers and the Collegium Singers Early Music Choir, and served as the chair of the Division of Conducting and Ensembles for 10 years. He founded Seattle Pro Musica in 1973 and Choral Arts Northwest in 1993, and has served as conductor of the Pacific Northwest Bach Festival, the Seattle Symphony Chorus, and Pro Coro Canada. His many guest conducting engagements include appearances with the Swedish Radio Choir, the Santa Fe Desert Chorale, Vocal Arts Ensemble of Cincinnati, and the Anchorage Music Festival, among others. His doctoral dissertation, The Swedish Choral Miracle, a cappella work since 1945, won ACDA's Julius Herford Award, and his recent book, The Conductor's Toolbox, is published by GIA. Welcome, Dr. Sparks.
Good to be here.
Today, our topic is to talk about early music and Dr. Sparks's long experience with that repertoire. And I thought maybe it would be helpful just to frame what exactly does it mean when we talk about early music? What time periods are we encompassing and the repertoire there? What does that say to you, Dr. Sparks, when we talk about early music?
Well, it can include a whole wide range of things. When I was at UNT, the Collegium Singers did things as early as the very early Renaissance period, not quite medieval music, but we did things by, for example, John Tavener, who was very early Renaissance, and obviously through the High Renaissance, sort of early Baroque music, Schütz, Monteverdi, early Baroque music, within that sort of range as well, Buxtehude, high Baroque, Bach, Handel, Vivaldi, Zelenka, other works like that. And we dipped our toes into the early classical, Mozart, other kinds of works during that period. So that's kind of the range we worked on, although it's interesting that even today there are people who are within what is still within the early music movement are recording works, for example, by Elgar, but using instruments of Elgar's period, which are somewhat different than those today. So it can be a really wide range, particularly if you're talking about instruments of a particular period. But most people are thinking about either Renaissance music through the Baroque period when they talk about early music.
Mm-hmm. And so from the bio that I just read, it's obvious that you started working with groups pretty early on in your career that were doing some of this music and with professional level groups. So tell us a little bit about how you got started working with early music and the career path that you've taken as a conductor with that.
Sure. I became interested in this music really early on, and I can't tell you all the exact reasons why that happened. It was mostly through listening, I think. I was just listening a lot as I was an undergraduate student to music of different types. I was interested in a pretty wide range, but I started getting interested in earlier music and for example, during the time that I was starting to do work, even before I started the Seattle Pro Musica groups, I was experimenting with music, even with my church choirs and with other groups. And for example, Stanley Ritchie, who is really a well-known Baroque violinist, he just retired a few years ago from Indiana University, where he ran the Baroque Orchestra and taught Baroque violin. Stanley actually came to the University of Washington as the first violinist in the quartet in residence there, the Philadelphia String Quartet. And Stanley had also been a Baroque violinist. I mean, his background is pretty wide. Grew up in Australia, came to the United States. He was the associate principal at the Metropolitan Opera, to just show you the range of his abilities. But he became interested in Baroque violin, studied with a number of people both in Europe and in the United States. And so he brought his interest when he came to the University of Washington. And by that time, I had started work with Seattle Pro Musica. I had started working with a group called the Bach Ensemble, which did Bach cantatas every Sunday,
Hmm.
or every month, once a month, that is. We did
Okay.
a Bach cantata. And I was using modern instruments. So I asked Stanley if I could take some lessons with him on how to work with modern instruments, but try to approximate what Baroque instruments do and learn about what Baroque instruments did and how to work with modern instruments to get that effect. So I did exactly that with Stanley. And then later we started, the last couple of years, 1970 to 1980, we started going towards using period instruments, which meant that our violinists got Baroque bows. They usually had a second instrument that they strung with gut strings, and we started using period appropriate techniques. We started hiring Baroque oboists, Baroque flutes. So these were literally period instruments there, natural trumpets, etc., and started working with that. So this was a gradual interest of mine, which expanded in 1975. A guy named Robert Scandrett, who was at Western Washington University in Bellingham, north of Seattle, whom I'd gotten to know through my high school teacher. Bob decided to do a study tour in England, and I got invited to go and be a part of that. And it was pretty extensive, and it was not limited to Baroque music, of course, but I mean, we did all sorts of things, including an interview with Roger Norrington at his home, as well as sitting in on one of his rehearsals of the Monteverdi Vespers. This was in 1975, and also going to the Stour Festival, which was the festival of Alfred Deller, who was a really important and well-known countertenor. And during one of the concerts, we were invited to a little party at his home, which was in a Tudor mansion, you know. And so there are tents set up in the backyard, and there we are. And one of the tenors we had met at a couple of things, we chatted with and ended up going out for a drink with him and talking. He was also singing with Norrington in the rehearsals, so we had met him several different occasions. We also saw David Monroe with his early music consort doing a concert, first half, all of early music of various kinds, medieval, Renaissance music. And then the second half was all a series of Joplin rags that they had arranged for
Ah,
various things. And for that, David Monroe played a French bassoon doing things, and an American actually fretted instrument player who had played, you know, various lutes and things on the first half of the program played banjo for all of the Joplin rags. So it was a very interesting tour, and I got to know lots of things. And of course the experience of watching Norrington do his rehearsal of the Monteverdi Vespers made me convinced I needed to do that piece. And in 1976, I did do my first performance of the Monteverdi Vespers. And then 2 years later, in 1978, we did it again as a pre-concert performance for the American Guild of Organists National Convention, which happened to be in Seattle. And so, you know, it just happened sort of topsy-turvy, and I ended up doing more and more. The first Bach cantata I had done was when I had my first church job at a little Lutheran church in Seattle. And I got together a group of friends and hired a group of other friends to play. And that was cantata number 4, Christlag in Todesbahnen, which I could do because it was strings only. And we just did it with a string quartet and harpsichord. And that was how we managed to do it. So it was all modern instruments, of course, and basically a group of friends doing it for an afternoon performance at the church. But that's kind of how I got started, and it just grew. And then and during the time I was with Seattle Pro Musica, we ultimately had a chamber choir and a chamber orchestra. And with the chamber choir, we ultimately did a lot of major works. And these were not with period instruments, but we did, you know, the Bach B minor Mass and both Passions and the Christmas Oratorio and all of those kinds of work. Handel, Dixit Dominus, Handel, Messiah, of course, and and also some of the bigger Mozart works, Requiem, C minor Mass, all those kind of pieces. So all of this was just grist for the mill, and there were things I was interested in, so I managed to do them. And when I could do them with period instruments, I did.
Mhm. So, what do you view then as other, from a programming standpoint and a pedagogical standpoint, those of us, many of us watching are teachers,
Sure.
obviously, other than simply having historical representation of style periods, in our programming, what do you see as the particular value that early music brings to your programming, and what can you talk about a little bit of the opportunities that it presents and also the challenges that we have to be aware of and work with?
Sure. I would say in most cases, if you're a high school conductor, you're not going to have access to period instruments. So I'm not going to worry about that. And there's no reason that you have to have period instruments to perform this music. There's a lot that you can do with modern instruments and do it very well. I think if you're looking at Baroque works, whether you're looking at the Vivaldi Gloria or one of the Bach cantatas, which some of which are very approachable by a high school group. Particularly, the solos can be very difficult, but if you have somebody who can do the solos, then you can manage that. College groups, of course, can manage a lot of these kinds of works. There are quite a few that are manageable by college and university groups. I think they offer a particular kind of Baroque pieces tend to offer a particular kind of rhythmic interest. If they have fugues, there's a contrapuntal nature to that, which has a great teaching. I would say there's a great amount that can be taught through that. Independence of line, for example. And there is a lot of contemporary choral music being written that tends to be rather homophonic. And so this offers another alternative to allow your students to be very independent in that they're having to create their own independent lines and to be able to maintain that against other independent lines. In terms of teaching, of course, since if you're doing a fugue, if you can teach the fugue subject, you can teach that as a group so that it isn't as complicated as you might say in some ways, because if you can teach the fugue subject and be really aware of that, and if it is fugue and answer, where, for example, if it's a tonal fugue, that there will be some differences between the fugue and the answer, and you have to know what that is and how it works. But you have to be careful that people understand that the intervals might be different between the subject and the answer. But so as long as you're aware of that in teaching it, you can do that very easily. And so once you do that, then people can begin to learn that rather quickly. And then it's a matter of doing that. Now, we're not talking about doing the B minor Mass, and they're very complicated fugues. There will be some college and university groups which are capable of doing something like the B minor Mass, but those are going to be few and far between. But there are certainly cantatas that can be done, etc. And for a college group, there are some that can handle some of the Bach motets, which are, again, more complicated, more difficult, particularly those that are the double choir motets. And so, it's just great music, and it offers loads of possibility. Works like the Vivaldi Gloria are much simpler. There are some contrapuntal movements, but they are not super difficult. They're not the kind of counterpoint that Bach writes, for example. They don't have the complicated melismas that Bach may write in some of his counterpoint. So all of those make it. There are lots of high school choirs, lots of church choirs, which can do the Vivaldi Gloria, for example. So those become good teaching pieces. If you look back towards the Renaissance, again, if you look at a Renaissance motet, say Palestrina's Sicut Cervus, which is a really good example of a good teaching piece in the Renaissance, again, this is built on what is called points of imitation, where essentially with each new piece of text, Palestrina is writing a particular line, a particular melodic kind of line, which is built up and then imitated in the various parts. And once you teach that line with the different parts, then they have to learn again to be independent. And that is, again, a great thing, whether it's a high school choir or let's say a beginning a beginning kind of college choir, it teaches them a level of independence which is really powerful for them to learn to be an independent singer. What's even more interesting, if you can get to the point of doing it, is to then scramble the choir into quartet-like varieties and to see if they can, on an individual basis, hold their line while they're hearing all the different parts around them and they're not supported. But when you're learning that, you can easily do that. Or you can pair singers, a stronger singer and a weak singer on the same part if you're scattering them about. But all of these things, I think, teach great independence. And then learning how to express each line. How do you shape each phrase? It's wonderful in terms of teaching how to sing phrase shapes, because it is singing the phrase shapes and then hearing them in context within the counterpoint that makes the real interest in it. It's not homophonic music, it is contrapuntal music, which if it is phrased beautifully, one part will come out, then another in very interesting ways. And I think it's a great teaching tool in that sense. And it is wonderful for the singer's independence and ability to do that. So that's why I would say I think it's a great thing for people to do. And it, even if you do one, let's say, Renaissance piece on a program with a group of other pieces, that you teach these principles and let them go. It will also teach them principles of shape as they do another piece from another period. It will teach those same principles.
Sure. I've always thought that style shaping of early music that is kind of so associated with contemporary performances of early music is one of the hooks that we can latch onto for a choir to kind of get into doing the music and not just be something that's old and kind of
Right.
ossified and stultified and everything.
Yep.
So you talked about phrasing. What about articulations? Because particularly in Baroque music, often the professional recordings we hear and everything have very clear and definitive ideas about articulation. Where does all that kind of come from, do you think?
Well, the articulation has to come from, it comes really from the language. And
Mhm.
so as you look at the language and as you look at, I mean, particularly if you're performing Bach, if you do it in German, if you do it in the original language, if you do it in German, or you do an Italian Baroque piece in Italian. Of course, so many of these pieces are in Latin, and so that is a consistent language across many different cultures. Although one can, if one wishes, get into historical pronunciation of Latin, which was in fact different in Germany than it was in Italy, than it was in France. That's an exercise which you do not need to do. I mean, it is not necessary. If in the Collegium Singers, which was an advanced group at at North Texas, that was a group which I expected to be working at the highest level. And it was made up of advanced undergraduates and a lot of graduate singers, including our graduate choral conductors, but also, particularly in the last half of the time I was there, a lot of graduate vocal performance majors as well. I wanted them to understand these finer points of how one might do it, because I was assuming that some of these people might go out and sing in some of the professional choirs around the country. And if they did, they might be expected to understand how this works. So I was training them in a sense to be able to be a professional singer at a high level and to be able to come into a situation and immediately know how to phrase, to have at least an idea of what they're going to do if the person asks them to sing Germanic Latin or French Latin or something else, to have some idea or to be able to catch up to it very, very quickly. But it's not necessary. It's
Yeah.
something that can be fun. But the articulation comes from the meaning of the text. It comes from the language itself. And so that's where one gets that.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's not that different in how we phrase, in English either. If you're thinking of the meaning of the text, the articulation has to come from that as well. Our diction should come from what the text means and how that is expressed. It's a part of expression.
Mhm. And there's also, I think, a alignment then also with if it's an instrumentally accompanied piece, the alignment of articulation with the way that the period instruments would sound to line up the vocal articulations as well, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's very true. And of course, if you work with period instruments very much, you start to learn how period instruments naturally articulate things. Strings articulate in a particular way
Mhm.
if they're period strings. By the same token, if I understand how articulations work with period instruments, and I happen to be working with a group of modern instrumentalists, I can ask for certain kinds of articulations from them. And if it depends, I've worked with players who are very open to that and are really willing to do that, and others who are not so open to that. You know, one of the when I was at I conducted the Prochoral Canada, which is a professional choir in Edmonton, Alberta, professional chamber choir, and we worked a lot with musicians from the Edmonton Symphony. The One of the first years I was there, we did a performance of Messiah. We we had a group of instrumentalists from the symphony who were probably not the top players in the symphony that year. And I worked pretty hard in rehearsal to do certain things which they were trying to do. When we got into the performance, it pretty much all disappeared, and they went back to their usual habits of how they played Messiah.
Yeah.
In later years, we started to get sort of their top players, their concertmaster, their principal cellist, and they were much more open to doing these kinds of things, and they got really good at doing that. Plus, by that time, they had started to get in some guest conductors like Ivars Torrens, who's the chorus master and also a professional violist for Tafelmusik in Toronto, which is a Baroque period instrument orchestra, and he prepared the chorus for him, and he had been the principal violist for a number of years. So he understood these things very well. And so if he did concerts with them, which were all instrumental, he knew exactly what to ask for, and they grew to understand this kind of stuff. So it became much easier in those years. But that's, those are the things you have to think about as you work with them. But if you are working with period instrumentalists, they will start to shape things in a certain way. And that can help give clues to you and your singers about how to shape certain things as well.
Mhm. One of the experiences I had a number of years ago in my training was working with Jeanette Sorrell, who was the conductor of
Right.
Apollo's Fire, the Cleveland Baroque Orchestra in Ohio. And for instance, we were doing a St. John Passion at Kent State University when I was teaching there. And she always talked about the whale tone, the kind of
Uh-huh.
decay that would happen at the end of a long note on the string instrument, and getting the choir to try to
Right.
approximate that same type of sound and such,
Right.
which is, yeah,
Right.
kind of.
Yeah, I mean, one of the differences between the Baroque bow and the modern Tourte bow is the Tourte bow, it comes is narrower in the middle, and then it comes up at the ends, and a Baroque bow is tapered at the end. So
Mhm.
when you draw the bow is the more you get towards the end of the bow, the tip of the bow, the lighter it is, and therefore it will naturally you can't really press down. The other thing that is true of gut strings, if you're playing with gut strings, is if you press too hard, you'll get it'll start to make a scratchy non-musical sound.
Mhm.
And so Baroque violinists are used to making expressive noises more with bow speed than bow pressure, whereas modern violinists are very used to using pressure on the bowstring or on the string on the violin in order to change dynamic. You can't do that on a Baroque violin that is strung with gut. It just won't respond well.
Yeah.
And so all of those things make a difference. And so it's fascinating if you've not worked with period instruments to suddenly hear what they do. And then it gives you something to also to imitate and to listen to and to see what you can do with your voice. And so that makes a big difference.
Yeah. So you mentioned a few kind of iconic pieces of repertoire that you did, and things that are kind of an entry point perhaps into early music. I wonder if you have any pieces, let's say both from the Renaissance and maybe the Baroque and early classical, that are kind of touchstone pieces for you for those conductors who this is like my first foray into doing this with my group. And then beyond that, where do you kind of expand from there for a deeper dive for those of us who may have done some of this, but want to get into the greater challenges?
Well, I think, for if you're looking at Baroque music, if you're looking at sort of high Baroque music, I think if you want to look for a real challenge, the Handel Dixie Dominos is a virtuoso piece. It's very early Handel, written when he was in Italy, when he had left Germany for Italy, very young, and it is simply a virtuoso piece. So you have to have a really good choir to do it. It's super challenging. But if you've got a choir which can really handle the not pun not meant, but if you have a choir that can really do this kind of difficult writing, it's a great challenge for them, and that's a really wonderful piece to work on. But in terms of Bach, there are such a variety of cantatas, and if you start to look at the Bach cantatas, there will be a variety of different kinds of things. There are also the Bach Missa Brevis settings, which are usually, frankly, they are normally glosses on cantatas. In other words, he's stolen the music from somewhere else, from cantatas or instrumental works, and used them. But there are really some wonderful works in there.
Yeah.
And there are about 6 of those, and they are really wonderful works. They are so-called Lutheran masses, which means they're only Kyrie and Gloria. So they're not long, they're about cantata length. But they're really wonderful short pieces. Um, if you can't, if you cannot do the entire B minor mass, for example, you can't really approach that. Bach never wrote the B minor mass to be performed all in one time. But what he called the Missa was the Kyrie and Gloria. You can do the Kyrie and Gloria. It works perfectly well as a complete work. So you could do that. You could certainly do that. And then the Symbolum Nicenum is essentially the whole credo, which also works very well as a complete piece in and of itself. Or if you were trying, not probably with a school group, but you had a really advanced community group or group that you wanted to eventually do the entire, B minor mass, you could do 1 year. You could spend your time preparing the Kyrie Gloria, the Missa. You could spend the time the next year learning the Symbolum Nicenum. And then the third year, you could learn the other part of it and then do the complete mass. I mean, there are ways in which you can sort of approach those things. If you want a real fun challenge for the chorus in terms of Handel, Israel and Egypt is, of course, a chorus heavy, or the chorus heavy oratorio, which doesn't have much in the way of solo work, but has choruses galore. Um, and, there are various versions of that. Sort of the one that we know most may not be the proper version of it. Jeanette Sorrell, incidentally, has just recorded a version that she sort of prepared, made up, did, which is very interesting, I think, since you talked about Jeanette. But there are lots of things like this that are very, very interesting. And of course, Salenka is a composer who is, I think, underrated. There are lots of recordings of his masses, but they are long and they're difficult. We have a recording on YouTube of his, I'm just gonna blank right now, with Collegium singers. Why am I blanking?
Might have been one that I was singing in, and I don't remember what it was either.
It could be. It'll come to me in a bit, but
Yeah.
it's a fabulous piece, very intense. And even if you chose to do just the first movement of it, which is the really intense movement, some of the fugues in it are challenging. And Salenka's fugues are almost always challenging because they're almost always long and they're hard to shape for the conductor. For the conductor, they're difficult to shape and make sense out of, and therefore they're also difficult for the choir to shape and make sense out of. But for that particular piece, the opening movement is just fabulous and intense and very dramatic, and could by itself make a wonderful piece on a concert if you had it. And it's just strings. So is it just strings? I think so, but I'll have to look at it. You can look it up on YouTube.
on YouTube.
Look up Tsolenka and UNT Collegium Singers and you'll find it, because I think that's the only Tsolenka we did during my
Yeah.
time there.
And on the other spectrum, the other side of the spectrum, I'm thinking of, some of the works by like Michael Haydn and
Right.
Pachelbel, and are, have a lightness to them, and ease to them,
Yes.
that are kind of a easy entry point to getting
Yes, and
started.
those are easier, of course,
Yeah.
and there are quite a few. There is Pachelbel Magnificat. There are all sorts of pieces by those composers which are very approachable. I'm doing, what is it? Laetare Dominum by Johann Michael Haydn with Montana Allstate, for example, in the
Ah,
fall,
hmm.
um, which is short. I mean, it's 3.5 minutes. It's two trumpets and two violins continuo, and it's very approachable, and it's a lovely piece. You want to look at Mozart, something like the Regina Coeli is not so long. It has solos which are not so difficult, that even good high schools can do it. Good church choirs can do it. College choirs can easily approach it. Even a college choir which isn't a super high level, or this is maybe their first entree into doing a slightly larger work. It isn't that long. It's what, about 7, 8 minutes, something like
Hmm.
that. But there are a whole group. There are Mozart Missa Brevis, which are very approachable, um, because Mozart complained because, of course, he was stuck in Salzburg at the time, and he complained that the Archbishop made him do an entire mass setting within the course of just this many minutes.
Right.
You know, but what it means is that you have these entire mass settings which are relatively short. Joseph Haydn
Hmm.
also has some really wonderful. The Little Organ Mass is a beautiful piece. There are a number of those kinds of pieces which are really quite wonderful. Um, Back to Mozart, a little more challenging, but the Vespers settings, are also very beautiful and approachable. They're a little more challenging just because there is so much more Latin, and the Latin is less familiar Latin. So if you have a choir that hasn't done much Latin, then it's challenging just because you have to teach a lot of language. But if you have a choir that's a little more accustomed to that, it can be done. And they're very challenging, but very beautiful pieces, very beautiful settings. We have the Collegium Singers did the less known Vesper setting, the Vespere
Hmm.
de Domenica, which is really fun, I think. It has a really challenging soprano solo on the Laudate Dominum, which is full of fireworks. Whereas the Laudate Dominum on the other setting is slow and absolutely gorgeous. And if you,
Yeah.
you have a wonderful soprano that can do that, it's maybe the setting to do. But if you have one that can do fireworks, as we did, then the setting that we did with Collegium Singers, which I've almost never heard done.
Yeah.
I thought it was really fun to do. But yeah, so
Yeah.
great kind of
So
stuff.
even for, community level groups, I have a community chorus, and we did a whole program last spring that I called classical with a capital C, meaning all
Right?
repertoire from the classical period.
Yep.
And it was the Haydn Little Organ Mass. It
Yep.
was the Mozart Ave Verum Corpus, uh,
Hmm.
a different Mozart Regina Coeli setting. He wrote three or four of them.
Yes, he did.
And this one was a multi-movement one, that choir was first and last movement, relatively straightforward. I had a good soprano soloist to do the other two movements in the middle. And then a work by Mariana Martinez, a female
Ah,
composer who knew Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven all in Vienna at that time. And we did the first movement of a Dixie Dominus setting of hers, which
yep.
also was a great piece.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of this repertoire which is really approachable, and can provide a wonderful variety of things. And if you have access to some players, and of course, if you don't have a really large player, you don't absolutely, for lots of these classical works, you don't have to have a full orchestra. You can do it one string on a part. You can do it with a string quartet or a string trio, since most of Mozart's Missa Brevis have no viola part. And so it's just two violins and cello, bass, and either organ if you can get it, or harpsichord if you want to substitute that, or even piano. You can make these pieces work. in a variety of ways, and they are all really wonderful pieces to do. So, I mean, they can provide a real difference on your program. They're wonderful teaching, I think, for your singers, and they're fun to sing. They really are.
Absolutely.
So lots
Well,
of great.
speaking of a piece that I think is fun to sing, and you've referenced some of the works with the Collegium Singers at UNT, the Vivaldi Gloria recording that you made, the live stream recording, which has been posted on YouTube, has garnered over 5 million views now.
Yes, it's sort of
Has become very
surprising.
popular in the choral world. So I thought for those maybe who haven't had a chance to listen to that, I would play just a little bit of an excerpt of it, and then we can come back and
Sure.
get a sense of uh, what this sounds like. This was a period instrument orchestra,
Right.
obviously, and a very familiar piece. Speaking about the Vivaldi Glory again, this is a piece
Sure.
that's so accessible to groups at many different levels, high school, community, collegiate, church choir, even. Um, a couple of words of wisdom, maybe, or things to draw a conductor's attention to if they're going to approach that particular piece.
Sure. I made the decision to do that piece, conducting it in two. Lots of people have conducted it in four. For me, the natural flow of the rhythm flows into the harmonic. For me, always very important to think about what the natural harmonic rhythm of the music is. I think of that more than I think about the time signature, whether it's a 4/4, it's a common time, or a cut time. I really look at the harmonic rhythm of the piece, and the harmonic rhythm of this is very much feels into Gloria, Gloria, and Gloria, Gloria, seems very pedantic to me, and it doesn't flow with the music. So definitely I'm conducting it in two. Um, Occasionally people have called because they've used this music to they've used this recording to practice with, and that's probably why it's gotten so many views. And occasionally people have written in and said, it seems odd because this is in D flat, or it's whatever. And then I have to tell them, well, that's because we're using period instruments, and with these period instruments we're also looking at a Baroque pitch, which is approximately a half step lower than A440. And it's somewhat of a construct because, of course, pitch varied a lot in the Baroque period and over time, in general. And so, but since we perform in modern eras, we want to be able, if you're a player, and particularly if you're a wind player, where you cannot change the pitch of your instrument very much as the oboist can't, we've sort of settled at, A415 or a half step below A440 as the sort of generic pitch for Baroque period instruments, for the high Baroque. And so for that reason, it's a half step lower than D major, than what we think of as D major. And we have a keyboard that can be also tuned to that level. So that's what we do. And so it confused some people who were listening to it. And if they would practice to that and then they would go to their choir rehearsal, it would be like, whoa, what's going on? So I just warned people, if you listen to this recording and you practice to it, you're going to be surprised when you get to your choir rehearsal and you're practicing with your piano and it sounds it feels and sounds higher. But in terms of this music, for me, for sure, harmonic rhythm is where this lives. And so all of this Gloria, Gloria, and then Glom in excelsis Deo, all these longer phrases work so much better in two than dee da da, just seem clunky and out of the way. And so all of this is part and parcel of creating a nicer line for those sections than the more active sections of the music. So we're trying to take what we listen to in this music and what I see as more active and what I see as more linear, and I'm trying to have the choir shape it that way. So part of it is finding out where that goes and then where I find that happening. People might notice as they look at this that you're seeing again those bows with the Baroque bows with the lighter tip. So that's going to create some of the sound they do. If they watch the cellos, they will see the cellos have no end pin and they're holding the cellos between their legs, actually, which means that the cellos are not going to be as bright and as boomy as a modern cello would be, where the end pin is stuck in the stage and will be able to be a brighter sound, including also the fact that they will have steel strings, or at least partially steel strings. And so that's going to be a lot brighter sound from the strings than it would be with Baroque strings that are strung with gut. They will see the oboist. You can't see the oboist entirely, but the oboe normally has one or two keys only. The rest of it is all like a recorder would be, just with holes, which means that in order to get certain accidental, the oboist has to use what are called fork fingerings, which means that certain things have more holes covered, which makes for a variety of sounds, because if all the holes are open, it's a brighter sound. If more holes are covered, it's a little more covered sound. So that makes for natural differences. And you hear that more in a couple of the solo movements, which are in other keys, which call for more holes to be covered. And so those are things which a Baroque composer knew about. And so if they went into a different key with a flute or an oboe, they knew that naturally some things would be covered. And then you see that the trumpet player is playing a natural trumpet, which has no pistons, no keys. So it's all natural. He's only doing the notes with his lip. He's creating it all through natural harmonics, which is not so difficult in this piece. It gets very difficult if you're doing the B minor mass and you're having to play that stratospheric stuff and play it very accurately. Then for a Baroque trumpet player, that's very challenging. For the chorus, it's a matter for me of trying to get them to shape phrases and to shape them in a way that works. But, you know, this first movement is not a complicated movement, really. It's really pretty easy. And you get into some of the other movements, and then there are these, I won't really say fugal in the sense, they're contrapuntal, but true fugues in the sense you might think of as Bach, you're not going to see quite in the same way. But you absolutely have counterpoint that has to be shaped. Et in terra pax omi, you know, and that's where the real fun comes, is in trying to get your choir to learn how to shape those things and to feel how those lines move both against each other and then how they come together and how they create tension and release. And that's a big part of making this piece work, I think.
Mhm.
So,
I haven't listened to the whole recording in a long time, but I'm wondering if, as you went from movement to movement, then are there places in a work like this which is broken up into the long Gloria text is broken up into multiple movements, cantata style, we would call it.
right,
Are there places where you take a pause versus going a taka from one movement into the next because of what the text is
absolutely.
saying or the musical style?
Absolutely. And it's been a long time since I've done this. And this, frankly, is the only time I've ever done this piece. I
Ah,
had, al- I had always avoided the Vivaldi Gloria just because I'd heard it done by so many church choirs and so many groups, and usually not very well,
yeah,
that I'd never done it. And then I just suddenly felt like, okay, it's time to do this. And let's see if we can do it in a really good way, you
yeah.
know, with legged singers and Baroque orchestra. Um, but yes, whenever you're doing multi-movement pieces, it's incredibly important to figure out how to pace a big piece and to think of where movements connect and where multi-movements connect and where there are moments of repose where something ends and it needs a little time before something goes on.
Mhm.
And and hopefully you can figure that out by how the composer writes it. You know, sometimes it has to do with text, sometimes it has to do with music, and usually in the best composers and the best compositions, it's a combination of both. The composer has paid attention to the text, and then as they write the music, they come to places where it is logical to take more time. If you're doing a Bach passion, very clearly Bach has thought through the drama of the piece, and you tend to know where things have to drive ahead according to the drama of the passion story, and where there needs to be a little space and time for some relief before the next thing happens. But that's incredibly important. But you know, if you're doing any big piece, obviously in oratorios, whether it's Haydn creation, um, you know, if you're doing a Mendelssohn oratorio, it doesn't really matter the oratorio. It has to be shaped, and you have to think very carefully of how to shape a big piece. You know, because you've done so much musical theater. It's in musical theater, it's absolutely, you have to do the pacing very, very carefully. Otherwise, if it's a succession of small events, it seems to take forever. But if all of the small events are shaped within the drama of the musical and they're all connected in a logical way of what is happening in the story and what is happening for the characters, then it happens. It's no different if you're doing a Bach Passion. It's no different if you're telling the story of creation in the oratorio. It is still the same thing. So that becomes really, really important. And it's just as important um, if you're doing the Beethoven Ninth Symphony, you know, or any big work, that your pacing of things and your decisions about where to take time and where you have to push ahead are just as important. And that always takes a lot of thought. And ideally, that always comes out of the music. And your kind, you know, that's your job as conductor, to think a lot about how this music is put together, and then how to think very carefully about it. And it does not mean that there's one right answer, because we all know in music that is rarely the case, that there is one right answer about any of that. And two different conductors might have different approaches, and they both may have real validity. And you can hear two great conductors do the same work, and they may hear it slightly differently and feel it slightly differently, and they may work very well. But what is important is that you do think through those efforts. And so definitely, and I can't remember because it's been a long time since I did that, but I would have thought very carefully about how those movements connect and whether it was a moment of repose where I needed to take time, or it was a moment where I needed to really push on and connect in such a way that the drama keeps going.
Mhm. And in the Vivaldi particularly, I mean, there's one move, what looks like a movement that's only like 6 or 8 bars long. And even
Yep,
though there's a double bar at the
right.
end of our modern editions, it's really not a double bar to stop and think about it. It leads into the next
No,
thing that happens, right?
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And that's true in so many multi-movement pieces. You just have to think about that. Is this an end of a section where it calls for a little time, or is this just the middle of a section and we've got to push on?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's very important to do that as a conductor, that you really think through that, and that you teach your students that that's going to be the case, as you rehearse it.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I did a Bach Passion while at UNT, and that was one of the most important things that I had to do is as we were rehearsing, I needed to rehearse every single transition that was going to be sudden so that they were used to it, that I didn't rehearse little separate movements. And then when we got towards the end, all of a sudden I'm pushing on and they aren't ready for it.
Uh-huh.
I had to rehearse that in from the beginning so that every transition is well rehearsed. And I normally tell conducting students that if you've got a tricky transition, you rehearse it every time. You don't, even though what I'm concerned with is what's in this movement here. When I get to this movement there, I don't stop here. I go into the next movement and then I stop and I go back to what I was interested in working on. Because if I don't make that transition, then the choir doesn't learn how to do it. And then when you finally get ready to do it, it's going to feel awkward and it will not be smooth. Whereas if you always make that transition, it'll just happen so naturally. So that's a really important tip, I think, for everyone.
Yeah. Great. Well, as we come towards the end of our time here, I want to kind of pivot slightly
Yes,
and recognize, of course, that you've done a lot of work with very contemporary music as well. The
right.
Swedish choral repertoire of the mid 20th and late 20th century, new works. Have been engaged with premiering and recording works of Frank LaRocca, who's a contemporary American composer. So, what do you see as the links, if any, between the music of the contemporary time and going back to early music, and how can one help inform the other?
Well, I think how many links there are depends a little bit on the composer.
Sure.
Frank is somebody who is steeped in that. First place, Frank is a dedicated Catholic, and the works he does are meant to be a part of the liturgical tradition of the Catholic Church. So he is very clearly interested in connecting with that tradition.
Uh-huh.
One of the motets he did in as part of the Mass of the Americas, which I have done and recorded, very obviously has a gloss in the middle of one of the motets to the bird Ave Verum. And I mean, you have to know the bird Ave Verum to realize what he's doing, and that it's a slightly disguised, but not very disguised quote from the bird in terms of this one dissonance that the soprano and alto quote from that in terms of the way they approach this dissonance.
Uh-huh.
And in all sorts of other ways, he brings in these other things that he really means to use. And so you have to understand that if you're going to do Frank's works, you have to understand that background, because he is always interested in that. And with some of the Swedish works, there is not that kind of direct kind of thing, but the Swedish composers are, depending upon who you're talking about, are very interested in that. I mean, Sven David Sandström is extraordinarily interested in all kinds of things. And of course, he died a few years ago, but he ended up doing some glosses on the Bach motets. And
Mhm.
he takes the Bach motets, he structures his motets with the same divisions of texts as with Bach. He does not copy Bach's language in this case, but he does sort of things. He also writes a high mass, which is structured exactly the same as the movements of the Bach B minor mass.
Hmm.
And it is not he's not copying the music of Bach. He's not imitating Bach's music, but he uses that as a basis for what he's writing. And so Sven David is always very interested in those kinds of things. He also does a really interesting gloss on uh, on Purcell, where he begins with literal stating of the Purcell "Hear My Prayer," and then as it cadences, the cadence just kind of disintegrates, and then he goes off into his version of it,
Mhm.
which is very dissonant and very crazy, and then kind of quiets down and comes to just this very placid C major chord. I mean, it's an extraordinary piece, but I mean, so there is contemporary music which does this. There is other contemporary music which glosses in a different way. I mean, for example, Carolyn Shaw, who is a very well known and kind of a hot composer these days.
Mhm.
If one knows the Buxtehude Membre Jesu Nostri, which is this series of meditations on Christ on the cross, which really goes from Christ's feet all the way up to Christ's head, which is the different movements that Buxtehude uses. Um, Carolyn does this series of pieces, which are of the feet, of the heart,
Hmm.
of the head, but they're in her own language. She isn't trying to copy Buxtehude's language, but one could do, and some people have done things where they pair the Buxtehude with Carolyn Shaw's version. So you're hearing both. And it's a very interesting juxtaposition of two composers' uh, vision, and then, you know, a different language and a different composer's vision of that same text. So there are very interesting things that some composers are doing with that.
Mhm.
Uh, there is oh goodness, there's a Sven David also has a Magnificat, which is somewhat based on the Bach Magnificat. And there's a recording somewhere on YouTube, which is quite interesting because the conductor, who's actually one of the basses, I don't know if he's still singing with them, but one of the basses in the Swedish radio choir, was a very good, high level, almost professional church choir, who does both of the pieces. And the Sven David piece is quite fascinating because it's the same instrumentation as Bach, and and it's quite fascinating to hear those two versions of the Magnificat text with the
Yeah.
same instrumentation idea.
Yeah.
But so there are people doing that kind of thing.
I've always thought it's a fascinating programming concept to try to put music of completely different stylistic epochs together against each other in a
Right.
program
Yes,
and
it is.
feel thematic links or something like that that gets us out of, okay, if we're going to do early music, we're doing all that at the beginning of the concert, and then
Right.
we're going to move through time period and end with a
Yes.
spiritual or that type of thing.
Yeah.
That there can be some really creative use of programming in
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah. And I've tended, I think, with my choirs that aren't doing, period instrument stuff. I've tended to not want to program, early to late.
Yeah.
Uh, or early to late with some lighter music at the end. I may want some lighter music at the end, but I don't necessarily want, I always want to think of putting pieces together that either complement each other or make interesting contrast, but whatever the pieces are that are next to each other, there should be a freshness for the audience as they hear one piece and then the next piece. And sometimes conductors don't think about some of the things they ought to think about, and they end up with three pieces in the same key in a row, and that is subconsciously very stultifying for the audience and for the
Mhm.
singers as well. They hear three pieces in the key of G, and you aren't thinking about it, but honestly, your ear just gets dulled. You need to hear some sort of a contrast, and so I mean, whenever I used to program, I always, on the little pieces of paper that I would put together programs, I always had the key written because I did not want to inadvertently end up with multiple pieces in the same key all of a sudden that were right next to each other. But I was always thinking about how can I make interesting contrasts so that for the audience it feels fresh and interesting as we go to that next piece. Where how does it either complement or contrast or make it interesting after that last piece?
Yeah.
So very important, I think.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate all the wisdom that you shared with us, Dr. Sparks. And I'll just say to our Midwest ACDA audience or whoever else is watching this that Dr. Sparks is still active as a guest conductor and as a clinician. He mentioned doing the Montana All-State coming up here and is working with some professional groups. So I'm sure if you have interest in what he's doing, or he would love to hear from you as well, as would I and the leadership of Midwest ACDA. If you have ideas of these types of professional development offerings that you would like to see us produce, please reach out to the R&R coordinators through Midwest ACDA or write to me. I'm Kerry Glann at Ball State University, KGLANN at bsu.edu. It's really easy to find me. So we thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Dr. Sparks, for spending this hour with us and talking
Very
with us
welcome.
so well about early music.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.